So, you've heard the name, right? Das Kapital, Karl Marx's massive book. For a lot of people, it's this famously difficult, intimidating thing. For others, it's maybe the most important critique of capitalism ever written. But what's undeniable is that its ideas have totally changed the world. So in this explainer, we're going to do something ambitious. We're going to follow Marx's chain of logic, step by step, to see how he tried to crack the central puzzle of the system.
And it all starts with that puzzle. This is the mystery that's at the heart of the entire book. Just think about it. If everybody in the market is playing by the rules, if every single thing is bought and sold for what it's actually worth, no cheating, no tricks, then how does anyone consistently make a profit? You start with $100, you buy some stuff, you sell it. How do you end up with $110? Where did that extra $10 just appear from?
So to solve that mystery, here's our game plan. We're going to start with what Marx called the commodity, the basic building block. Then we'll uncover a so-called magic commodity that holds the key. That's going to lead us straight to his big answer, surplus value. And finally, we'll zoom out and look at how Marx saw this whole system starting and where he thought it was headed, which will leave us with a pretty big question for our own time.
Okay, so if you want to understand this gigantic, complex thing called the economy, you'd probably think you should start with something big, right? Like, I don't know, Wall Street, or the government, or global trade. But Marx, he did the exact opposite. He started with the smallest, most basic, most boring thing you can imagine, a single commodity. Just one simple product sitting on a shelf.
Because he noticed that every single one of these things, from a cup of coffee to a car, has a kind of split personality. It has two different faces, two sides to its nature, and we have to understand both before we can get anywhere.
On the one hand, you've got its use value. This is super straightforward. It's just what the thing is for. A jacket's use value is that it keeps you warm. A pen's use value is that you can write with it. Simple. But then on the other side of the coin, you have its exchange value. This is its power to be traded for other things. That same jacket might be worth 2 pairs of shoes on the market. So how useful it is and what it's worth in trade, those are two totally different things.
And that right there raises the next big question. How in the world can we say a jacket is worth 2 pairs of shoes? They're completely different objects, different materials, different functions. What's the common denominator? What's the universal stuff that allows us to compare them and stick a price tag on them?
For Marx, the answer was revolutionary in its simplicity: human labor. The one single thing that all of these different commodities have in common is that a human being had to work to produce them.
And just like the commodity, he argues that labor itself has two sides. There's concrete labor. That's the specific skill, being a good tailor or a good shoemaker. But what really determines economic value, according to Marx, isn't the type of work. It's abstract labor. It's just human effort in general. The time, the energy, the sweat, stripped of any specific form. That's the universal substance of value.
But, and this is a really important point, value isn't just about how long one person takes. If I'm a really slow tailor and it takes me 3 days to make a jacket, that doesn't make it 3 times more valuable. Nope. Marx says value comes from the socially necessary labor time. That's the average time it takes to make something, under normal conditions with the average technology and skill that society has. It's a social average, not an individual one.
Okay, so we've got our first big clue. Value is determined by the average labor time needed to make something. Now that we have that piece, we can finally get back to the main event, solving that profit mystery. And the key, Marx says, lies in finding one very unique commodity.
See, Marx noticed 2 completely different circuits of exchange happening. The first one is pretty simple, CMC, or commodity, money, commodity. This is like a farmer selling wheat, a commodity, for money, only to use that money to buy clothes, another commodity. The goal is just to end up with something useful you didn't have before. But the capitalist circuit is different. It's MCM prime, money, commodity, more money. You start with money, buy a commodity, and then sell it to end up with more money than you started with. That little dash, that prime on the second M, that's the profit. And that's the whole point of the game.
The key to figuring out how you get from M to M prime, how that extra money gets created, is hidden in one single, very special commodity that's for sale in the open market. A commodity that can do something no other commodity can.
And that commodity is labor power. Now, pay close attention to the words there. It's not labor itself. It's the worker's ability to work, their capacity to perform labor for a set amount of time.
So, what's so magical about labor power?
It's this. It is the only commodity in the entire marketplace that, when you use it, it creates more value than its own cost. Think about it. When a capitalist pays a worker a wage, they're buying their labor power for the day. That wage covers the cost of keeping the worker alive and ready to work, food, rent, and so on. But the actual value that worker produces during their workday can be much, much more than the value of their wage. It's like buying an engine that produces more fuel than it consumes.
And that brings us finally to the solution. The source of all profit, according to Karl Marx, is something he calls surplus value. And that's really just his technical term for the value created by unpaid labor.
Let's break down the workday to see how this works. You can think of it as being split in two. For the first part of the day, which Marx calls necessary labor, the worker creates enough value to cover their own wage. So, if their wage is worth, say, 4 hours of work, by lunchtime they've basically paid for themselves, but they don't go home, do they? The rest of the day is what Marx calls surplus labor. Every bit of value they create during that second half of the day is unpaid, and it goes directly to the capitalist. That is surplus value. That is profit. So naturally, the goal of the capitalist is to make that surplus labor part of the day as long as possible. And Marx points out two main strategies for doing this. The first one is called absolute surplus value. This one's pretty blunt. Just make the workday longer. If you force people to work 10 hours instead of 8, those 2 extra hours are pure surplus value. The second strategy is called relative surplus value, and it's a bit more clever. This is about boosting productivity. If you bring in new machines, maybe the worker can produce the value of their wage in just 3 hours instead of 4. The workday is still 8 hours long, but now 5 of those hours are surplus labor instead of 4. The profit goes up.
Okay, so we've seen the engine room of the system. We know how profit is generated. But this raises a huge question. How did we get into a situation where a small group of people owns all the factories and machines, and almost everyone else has nothing to sell but their own labor power? Let's zoom out and see what Marx had to say about the system's brutal beginnings and its potential end. You know that old story about how capitalism started? That some people were just really thrifty and hardworking, while others were lazy? Well, Marx thought that was a complete fairy tale. He argued the real starting point was a process he called primitive accumulation, and it wasn't peaceful at all. It was a violent, historical process of kicking people, like farmers and peasants, off their land, the very thing they used to make a living. Think of the enclosure movements in Britain. Once they were separated from their land, they had no choice. They had to flood into the cities and sell the only thing they had left, their ability to work.
This famous quote really sums up his whole view on the matter. That initial pile of wealth, of capital, wasn't just the result of saving pennies. It was built, he argued, on things like seizing land, colonial plunder, and the slave trade. For Marx, the system was born in violence.
And once the system gets going, it creates this powerful, self-perpetuating cycle. It goes like this. Capitalists are driven by competition to reinvest their profits into better technology. But that new technology often makes workers redundant, which creates what Marx called a reserve army of labor, a pool of unemployed people. This reserve army then has to compete for the few jobs available, which puts downward pressure on wages for everyone. Lower wages mean higher profits, which leads to even more reinvestment, and the whole cycle starts over again, concentrating wealth in fewer and fewer hands.
And for Marx, this endless cycle points to a fundamental, inescapable contradiction baked into the very DNA of the system. On the one hand, modern production is incredibly socialized. Thousands, even millions of people all over the world work together in complex supply chains to create a single product. It's a massive team effort. And yet, the ownership of the factories, the product itself, and, most importantly, the profits, remains entirely private. This, for him, was the central flaw, a tension that could not be resolved.
Now, whether you agree with Marx's analysis and his conclusions or you completely disagree, there's no denying he provides a powerful and very different framework for understanding our economic world. And that really brings us to one final thought, one big question for us to consider.
It's been more than 150 years since he wrote all of this. We now live in a world of gig economies, artificial intelligence, and global financial crises. So the question is, do the dynamics that Marx identified, that cycle of accumulation, the creation of surplus value, that core contradiction between social production and private profit, do those things still shape the world we see around us today?